I think my biggest takeaway from this trip is that, of course, the Mongolians were the conquerors of the world because they were so strong of mind and body. And this diet that they eat, so full of the yellow fats, right? And the yellow dairy and all the stuff Weston A. Price talks about is exactly what makes you strong and almost like superhuman against the elements and everything else. And the way that it feeds the brain so that you're calm of mood and you have clear thought, all of that would really go into a very good leader.
From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health. And now here is our host and producer, Hilda Labrada Gore.
Hey, Hilda here. In the 1930s, Dr. Price traveled the world learning from indigenous people groups. He documented their dietary patterns, their overall health, and the influence of modernity on both. On a recent trip to Mongolia, Mary Ruddick had the same objectives in mind. This is episode 400, and our guest today is Mary Ruddick, a seasoned nutritionist who has been dubbed the Sherlock Holmes of Health. Mary travels the globe researching ancestral diets and their protective mechanisms on health. In October of 2022, Mary had the opportunity to visit Mongolia for an extended period of time. And today she describes to us what she learned during her experience there and through her research. She discusses the traditional high-fat diet of the Mongolian people and the changes that have come with the introduction of flour in the 1800s. She shares her observations of the health of the general populace and why she believes their robust health played a part in the expansion of the Mongolian Empire. She also talks about the influence of modern foods like candy and technology like cell phones and how these may be altering the Mongolian culture. Finally, she discusses her experience staying with and hunting with Mongolian eagle hunters in the western region of Mongolia. I had the privilege of accompanying Mary on part of this life-changing trip, so I chime in here and there as well. Before we dive into the conversation, I want to invite you to check out the Real Milk website, realmilk.com, which is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation. This website is a source of reliable information on real raw milk. There are articles, blog posts, videos, and more that explain why raw milk is healthy, how it benefits you, and where you can obtain it in the United States. There's a map, actually, where you can plug in your zip code and find out exactly the closest locations to get real raw milk. And there's also commentary on the politics and economics of raw milk and industrial dairy. So much is there. So go to realmilk.com to find out more. And Second Spring Foods, sprouted pantry staples and freshly milled organic whole grain flours. Sprouting since 1985, Second Spring Foods is a family-owned and operated business in Ontario, Canada. They sprout a wide variety of grains and beans, and it's all organic. So go to secondspringfoods.com to find your favorite sprouted stuff. That's secondspringfoods.com and use the code WISE for 10% off. And remember that nourishing food traditions like sprouting and fermentation revitalize the modern pantry with whole foods. So you can also visit the Learn section of secondspringfoods.com for delicious sprouted recipes, information on how to sprout, and their free sprouted sourdough ebook. Once again, that's secondspringfoods.com and the code word WISE for 10% off. And by the way, shipping to the U.S. and Canada is free on all orders over $65. This is Hilda Labrada Gore, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Mary.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are amazing. I loved when we had you on the episode. I think we called it the Sherlock Holmes of Health, because you, much like Dr. Price, have traveled the world connecting with indigenous people groups, trying to find what gives them vibrant health. Is that not right?
Correct.
So recently, you and I both had the privilege of going to Mongolia. What made you pick Mongolia as your next destination?
You know, I've had my eye on it for a long time. I try to go to as many different climates and regions and parts of the world as I can so that I can see the differences and the similarities. I really try to get a lot of variety to my research. And luckily, I had been working with someone for about a year and a half who was able to get me in with the Kazakh eagle hunters and get us in with the eagle hunters. And last minute, I pulled the trigger and went.
Wow. Of course, I was there. So it feels funny asking you, but I'm asking you so that our audience knows. And then so you and I can go back and forth a little bit about what you learned there. What were some of the first things that you noticed in terms of the dietary habits of the Kazakh eagle hunters?
Do you know what was really interesting was that I had heard that it was primarily carnivore, or about 95% carnivore, and that it was very high fat. But it was actually shocking how high fat it was, even for someone like myself, who's been mostly in ketosis for over 15 years. For me, it was a lot of fat. So I mean, it was very high fat. And then it was also very interesting to learn about the seasonality of the way that they eat. For instance, that they're known for eating horse. Horse is a staple food for them, but it's not year round. It's only in the winter. And it's a specific way that they prepare it. And they use the whole animal, the skin for everything. Nothing goes to waste. And then also what was so interesting to me was to learn that in the summer, it's just dairy that's consumed. There's no meat, which was very interesting. There were so many little tidbits. I was blown away by the fact that they make an organ stew, kind of an organ broth like the Maasai do, and really heard multiple people claim that's what keeps them healthy. Very similar to the Maasai. So I saw a lot of similarities between the Maasai and the Kazakh eagle hunters, and that was a surprise. I did not expect that at all, given that the climate is so different. We're in the valleys of the mountains, right between the border of China and Mongolia. That was very surprising as well.
Yeah, and it struck me after we had one of these meaty, fatty meals. By the way, people eat with their hands, and I was like, wow, it just felt so connected. Like we were so connected to the animal. And I remember one of our hosts, like literally prying open the sheep or the goat's head to give us the brain, and then prying open a bone to give us the bone marrow. And it just felt so amazing. But it also struck me that if anyone was trying to be a vegan or vegetarian in that part of the world, they wouldn't be able to survive because there's not a carrot in sight. The land is not arable. So they have to eat meat and fat and whatever they can glean from the animal, the butter and the milk, the yak milk and the butter that were so abundant.
Yes. Yeah. Really nothing can grow there. And so unlike other Asian countries, they're not rice consuming. They don't consume all these vegetables. In fact, there's so many different ethnic groups in Mongolia. But of everyone I think we talked to, I just kept hearing the Mongolians, whatever tribe they were from, say that they felt that vegetables were bad for them and that they shouldn't eat them. And I think that comes from the fact that things aren't fresh there. Their traditional diet did not contain that, although other regions of the world certainly have vegetables and you can be perfectly healthy on those. For the Mongolians, it's not naturally grown there, and therefore it's really imported from far away, and a lot of problems can come from that. So they're very meat and dairy eating area.
Yes. And Mary, didn't a friend of ours during our tour, literally, I feel like he said something like this, if I'm unhappy, meat makes me happy. And he didn't just mean it makes me cheerful. Like he meant it changes my mood.
Yes, exactly.
And what you're describing also is exactly what Dr. Price found, that the healthiest people groups were not eating the same foods as you just pointed out, but they were eating what was available locally. And that made up their traditional diet.
Yes, I think that's really the key here. And that's definitely been the key finding in all of my research around the globe, is that it's very regional. They're not importing. No one is, right? They're not bringing things in to grow. It's very regional. And really, if we look back historically in regions that really grew as metropolis, as cities, places like Egypt, right? Cairo and Alexandria, these places would have some of the modern day diseases like we do now. And outside of those regions, you really didn't see that in the medical texts. You didn't see it. And I certainly don't see it in the regions that I go to. So I think there's something that's quite problematic with bringing unnatural foods to a region. I think when someone is from a region and from a family line where they're continuously consuming the same foods. They know exactly how to prepare it, right? There was so many interesting stories that we heard about. At this time of year, you do this with the food. And at this time of year, you do this. It's the exact same food, but they have different ways of preparing it during those times, whether someone is young or old. If you're trying to fortify yourself for battle, you might manipulate the dairy. Maybe it's going to be raw instead of fermented into a cheese curd. So all of these kind of wisdoms are known. And I think that's what's really lost when we start bringing a food from a different region to where we are now. We lose that. I don't know about you, Hilda, but I still dream about those cheese curds. They tasted like cookies.
I know they really did. So that takes us to my next question. I'm picturing the breakfast table. Please describe to us what you saw on the most traditional tables in Mongolia.
Yes. Can I give them the whole scene of driving up and arriving at these places?
Yes.
Because it's so majestic.
Of course.
Okay, so we're in this old Russian van, maybe from the 70s or 80s. It's adorable. And you're off-roading for hours. There's not really tire prints or roads underneath you. And you're driving through mountains and valleys. And then finally, after hours and hours of basically being a popcorn kernel in the van, you come across this beautiful scene of the gers, which are yurts. We would call them yurts, but they call them gers, G-E-R. The gers with the steam coming out of the top and the sun is setting. So we pull up. And we go inside and it's cold. There's snow outside and you go into the gur and it's nice and warm and toasty. You're taking off layers and you sit down and they immediately serve you a big old bowl of warm milk tea, which is an herb that they find along with the mare's milk, the horse milk, fresh with colostrum. And with that, you then put a spoon of ghee and a spoon of what we would call sour cream. They have a different name for it. And you mix it into the tea and you drink that. And as you're drinking that, they bring out all these plates of cheese curds. But don't think cottage cheese. These look like cookies and they taste like cookies. In fact, some of them taste like donuts, but their only ingredient is dairy. It's absolutely incredible. Some are rock hard. You break your teeth on them. You have to soak them in the milk tea. And others are soft like a shortbread cookie. And so you eat all of those. And while you're having those, you chat. Maybe you play some songs. So you sing together or someone plays an instrument. You're kind of having that kind of communal living. And then they serve your dinner or breakfast because they're basically the same.
That's right.
Yeah, breakfast and dinner are basically the same. It's the cheese curds, the milk tea, and then your big old plate of meat, right? Or it's almost like a stew because there's a bit of broth that's poured on top. But I don't know about you, I didn't see much water being consumed. It's not a water consuming place. And that includes when they cook with water, it's just a small amount. So you get some of the most tasty broth I've ever had, but just a small amount with your meat. And then you start eating and it's all served on one big plate and everyone goes in with their hands. Any big pieces like the head that you were talking about, the men will traditionally take a knife and cut it up into bite-sized pieces for the women and children, which I happen to have loved. It's so nice to not have to cut up my food. I felt like a kid again. It was great. And you really eat nose to tail, and it's not segmented like it might be in some other places. It's all in one dish. So you've got the head, the liver, the lungs, the skin, the leg. All of it is there together, and sometimes it'll be a mix of animals as well.
And on some of the tables, Mary, there were the beginnings of foreign foods being served. What I mean by that is, I think it was in the 1800s when flour was introduced perhaps to the Mongolians. And on some tables they had at breakfast time like little biscuits almost that were not curds, right? Or they would have noodles mixed in with their main dish. But because the brunt of their diet is still so traditional, I didn't notice too many negative impacts from that foreign food being introduced. Although I do remember two people specifically telling you, I don't feel well, and trying to figure out what was wrong. And you had the feeling that it was some of the foreign food that was causing them some issues.
Definitely, especially on the way to the furthest family that we went to visit, some of the places that we stopped at. I find the closer to towns they are, the more of the modern foods that they're eating. And most of Mongolia is now eating flour, really from the 1800s. So the wheat flour is pretty normal, even in the most remote houses, but it's not consumed the way we consume it. everything is made from scratch. So they're making noodles, they're cooking those noodles in a broth, and it's not the bulk of the diet. It's less than 5% of their calories. So it's there, and they make these little donuts that they dip in the sour cream, basically. And then they also make the noodles and they make dumplings, but it's not a bulk of the diet. Now, in the closer families, the families that aren't as hard to get to, you absolutely see the decline in health. It's not as severe, perhaps, as what we're used to, definitely. But if you go back a couple generations to our grandparents' generation, it's like that, I would say. So you definitely see, like, we met a young woman who it seems like she had a birth complication that pressed on a nerve. That's really what it sounded like to me. And so we saw some dental decay and things like that. But overall, people were very functional and healthy.
Yes.
So in comparison to what we're used to, it's just so small.
It's funny that you should say that about the dental decay, because I started thinking twice about one individual that we saw that seemed to have like false teeth, like a little bridge of false teeth in the front of his mouth. And I realized that could have been from an accident. It could have been that a horse or a camel kicked him in the mouth, and that's why he lost those teeth.
Yeah, I think for him, and we can ask him because I'm in contact with those guys, so we can find out. I was thinking that was an accident too. And to be honest, I didn't ask him any questions on health because I could see that family was eating a lot of modern food. And so it wasn't the kind of family that I would typically interview. But he definitely had lost all the top teeth, which does indicate more of an injury than decay. Decay usually starts in the back.
Exactly.
And on the lower teeth as well. We can definitely find out. And I will say, even with the closer in families, there's a tradition in Mongolia amongst the Kazakhs. And the Kazakhs, for those of you who aren't familiar, are actually from Kazakhstan. And they're a completely different ethnicity than most Mongolians. So they have different cultures, different religions, all sorts of things. But they have this tradition throughout Mongolia, whether you're Kazakh or not, to have a welcoming table. And on this welcoming table, you would typically put out things that are very special. Now, I want you all to try to arrest your normal associations, right? These folks are often very far away from a town. You may have to ride for hours on a horse to get to town, and anything you get, you have to carry back. The weather isn't great. It's pretty harsh, all right? It's a big commitment to do something like that. So typically you're only going to get the essentials, right? You're going to get maybe some water, maybe anything you might need for fixing the house, and then maybe the wheat flour, right? Because that's the one thing that they import from China. So you're not going to get a lot of extras. What they do is they'll get things to put on a welcome table. It's a custom to be very generous and warm there. And so they'll get candies and all sorts of these incredibly processed foods that they'll put on the welcome table. But what's interesting is that you often, especially the farther out you get, they're not actually eating it. They're just putting it out for you. They don't actually really like it. It's not their kind of food. So if we went to a house, our translator, who lives in a town, and he's Kazakh, so he speaks the language, but his family lives in a town, in a house, and all the normal things. And they absolutely ate the candy and enjoyed it. But the further out that you go, you tend not to see that.
Since you mentioned the welcoming thing, I have to say that when I was traveling through the Gobi, you and I split at one point, and I was going to the Gobi Desert with a guide and a driver, and that was it. And it was amazing. But I got a lot of time to talk to my guide, who is Mongolian and not Kazakh. And I was asking her about some traditions, and she said the way they welcome a baby is so special. And it really blessed me to hear about this tradition. So what they do is they invite family over to share like a mutton broth, a lamb broth. And then once the broth is cooled, the newborn baby is bathed in the broth. And it is done with the hope that the baby will be nice and strong and healthy.
That's just beautiful.
And then on my flight home, I wanted to watch a Mongolian movie, and I started watching this Mongolian movie. I think it was called Sedora. And in it, they did the tradition. They bathed the baby in this broth. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so beautiful. So I thought this would be a very Weston A. Price Foundation approved tradition that is just glorious and so wonderful for the baby. I had to bring it up.
Yes. I couldn't get over how many traditional dietary and lifestyle aspects were still, even in the modern day folks living in the big cities. Really, Mongolia is just I think, a little diamond of learning about tradition, because even the city goers, we're so big on meat. I can go to a restaurant and get horse head and all the organs are there and broth is common. And it's very easy to eat traditional food in the city. Same with the dairy, right? The dairy is truly incredible. I was blown away while we were there that all of this isn't being exported. I could live on that stuff. The fact that we don't have these cheese curds that taste like cookies as a travel food all over the world is really a pity.
I know.
It's so good. And it's all these probiotics. I was researching the different probiotic strains within it. And the ones that I was finding, I actually found quite a few studies on it. And there's L-planetarum, which is antihistamine, and all of these very, very beneficial strains that tend to live within the microbiome and help the health of the body. And I think it makes sense. I think my biggest takeaway from this trip is that, of course, the Mongolians were the conquerors of the world because they were so strong of mind and body. And this diet that they eat, so full of the yellow fats, right? And the yellow dairy and all the stuff Weston A. Price talks about is exactly what makes you strong and almost like superhuman against the elements and everything else. And the way that it feeds the brain so that you're calm of mood and you have clear thought, all of that would really go into a very good leader.
Coming up, Mary discusses how the beauty of the people and the way that they carry themselves points to their overall health as well.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions podcast from the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
Raw Optics. These are glasses that will change your life. Our body evolved in natural sunlight. Sunlight is still essential for our biological function. Man-made light disrupts our hormones, our nervous system, our sleep, and our overall health, day and night, but especially at night. This is why Raw Optics has designed red sunset lenses to be used after sunset to block the light that tricks the brain into thinking it's daytime when it's not. This allows for natural melatonin production and prevents melatonin and sleep disruption. It protects the body's natural circadian rhythm by allowing it to know when it's day and when it's night. And red sunset lenses relax the eyes and mind, allowing for an amazing feeling of evening relaxation. Fall asleep more easily and quickly, sleep more deeply, and wake up with more energy with red sunset lenses. Go to rawoptics.com, that's RAoptics.com, and use the discount code WISE for 10% off any order of any size. rawoptics.com and the discount code WISE. And Optimal Carnivore. Optimal Carnivore believes that organ meats are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet, and they want to make it easy for you to include them in the diet. Brain Nourish is their latest revolutionary new product that combines grass-fed beef brain and lion's mane mushrooms in a groundbreaking formula. It's the ultimate whole food nootropic to build a better brain. Studies have shown that both ingredients are remarkable for improving focus, lifting mood, improving memory, providing greater clarity, and enhanced creativity. So check them out. Go to amazon.com/optimalcarnivore and use the code Weston10 to get 10% off all products. And keep in mind that Optimal Carnivore also plants one tree for every product sold, which helps the environment. That's amazon.com/optimalcarnivore and the code Weston10. This is Hoda Labrada Gore, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Other than the handful of individuals that we encountered whose diet had modernized and who had a few health complications, like you said, nothing as big as over here with autoimmune conditions and stuff, but they had a few things niggling at them. What did you see in terms of the overall health of the population of the Mongolians? What did you observe about it?
I noticed, and this was another surprise, there were so many surprises, a higher concentration of people that look like they belong in the movies in Mongolia. So I really noticed the facial structure was very good. The posture was excellent. The body weight was excellent. The strength, and really see health in someone, the way that they carry themselves, the way that they walk and conduct themselves, and how much oomph they have behind their voice. I saw all of that. I don't think it's a coincidence that they're known for the throat singing, which no one else can do. There's some wonderful articles from about 100 years ago talking about how people were losing the ability to sing certain songs. And I really wonder if that's not from all the change in diet and lifestyle and the change in the microbiome and our ability to sing out with those kind of voices. And here in Mongolia, they're able to do a type of singing that we're not able to do in the rest of the world, like the two notes at once, the throat singing. Not everyone can do it. It's still a rare skill, even within Mongolia, but it's unique to them. And I think a lot of that comes from the way that they live, the communal kind of living, the being outside in the elements with nature, and then the very, very nurturing diet.
And the nurturing community, I would say, too. In the Gobi, I met with a Mongolian family that was nomadic and also had the traditions of herding the animals. I think they had yaks and goats. And I asked the grandmother something about what was the secret to your long life. And she said, family is everything. And she was living with her son, and he was helping to tend the animals. And she said she had 5 other children. And I think in total, they had over 60 family members between grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It was just amazing. But the smile on her face and the intimacy that comes from living in these gurs, as you were describing, these small dwellings that are geometrically round and beautifully shaped to withstand the elements of extreme temperatures and stuff in Mongolia. And so there's this intimacy that comes from everyone living under one roof. Or you might build a second gur, perhaps as your family grows. But it seemed to me that they're on top of each other. And this is part of the secret of their good health, is their connection with one another.
I think so too. I think it's the amount of touching. I noticed they were constantly hugging each other, holding each other. And even with us, the teenage girls were so smushy. They would just smush their faces into ours and want to hug and sit right next to us. And all of that you wouldn't get in most places of the world. There's a lot of oxytocin and feel-good chemicals that we release when we're being touched by others, when we're making eye contact with others. And I think the fact that they do sleep in one gur together and then are exchanging the bacteria together of eating from one plate, eating with your hands, you're certainly not washing your hands. There's not water around. In fact, there's a whole myth about the Mongolians being afraid of water. So they don't even camp near it. But there's always this exchange of bacteria from milking the yaks to then taking that milk and drinking that right away, and bacteria getting on the hands, and all this kind of beautiful dance and interchange of the microbes and of the feel-good chemicals. And they have a very close bond. They're a very warm culture, very welcoming culture.
I can't get the image out of my mind when we were invited to Oscar's family, this beautiful Kazakh eagle hunting family, to participate in their meals, to share with them, to abide with them for a few days. And they invited us to go to their winter home, which is more in a sheltered place in the mountains. So we were on horseback, and the father was singing a little song. He wasn't trying to impress us or be like, look what I know. He was just happy. He was content. So he was singing this song, talk about oxytocin. And then his daughters were following along. Why don't you complete that scene? And let's talk a little bit about the eagle hunting traditions now.
Oh, it was so beautiful. Yes, he sang for 15 minutes or more? And you could just see the joy within him. And I feel that the joy just really radiated from them at most times, if not all times. They really live at a higher level of joy than the rest of the world. And the eagle hunters are so fascinating. I've a lot of questions, I'm sure you have as well. People assume that they hunt eagles, or they think that the eagles are then hunting for them for food. And it's not like that at all. In fact, eagle hunting is only done for part of the year, primarily the winter, and really when there's snow cover. Luckily, we were there for snow cover, so we were able to experience it and go out with them as they went to train a new eagle and also go hunting. But it's a real skill. These girls, the last family that we stayed with, they're young, they're teenagers, young teenagers. And when you hold these eagles, they are so heavy, your arm is shaking.
I know.
And these girls are carrying the eagles. They mount a horse while carrying the eagle. And then they're riding the horse. And on the horse, there's a little stick that helps them hold their arm up, because you're out there for hours. But you still have to basically do a lot of the work to keep the eagle. So it's still very muscular. But they're calm and they're happy and they're laughing and making jokes. And it's a very quiet, peaceful experience. So the purpose of the eagle hunting is really for fur. It's to get fur so that they can then make their own clothing, their carpets. The Kazakhs make everything, and they're incredible seamstresses. Typically, the women, the mom and the girls will So all the carpets of the home, and you have to remember these gurs, these yurts are right on the ground. So it's cold, right? It could be very cold. So they make these very warm carpets that keep them warm through the year. And then they make beautiful wall hangings with all these bright colors that they stitch together, which is very different than the rest of the Mongolians. They tend to be rather more plain or more Tibetan in decoration, or Buddhist, really. So anyway, they go out to get warmth and clothing to wear to survive the harsh winter. So the eagles, they have this beautiful bond with the eagle hunter. And it's this relationship that's different than anything I've seen before. I don't know about you, Hilda, but they have a bond specifically with their eagle. And so it's not something that they pass around. They don't just grab a random eagle. But the bond is so tight that in their competitions, which they have a lot, is to have the eagle up on a mountaintop and the eagle hunter down in a valley. And the eagle hunter calls the eagle. And whoever's eagle comes the fastest to the eagle hunter is the winner of the competition. Imagine this. Full mountain peak to valley. All right. You can't even see the eagle. I don't know how only an eagle with eagle eyes could see the eagle hunter. The eagle hunter calls 20 seconds. The eagle is there on its arm. So they're really quite bonded. And you could have 10 different eagle hunters calling their eagles, and they're not going to the wrong.
That's right.
So it's a really beautiful experience. They typically go out and look for things like fox and some of the other animals that are quite warm. I've always wondered, I don't know about you all, I've always wondered how people stayed warm. I'll look at some of the history of costume books and these kinds of things. And I learned a lot on this trip. When we saw all of the boots that were lined with fur, suddenly it made so much sense. And the jackets lined with fur. So it can be this silk, very thick silk on the outside. So it looks like some of the Asian clothing that we've seen before. You would think, oh, you would freeze in that. But it's lined with fur, which keeps them very warm. And then they put a fur jacket on top. They make fur hats as well and all sorts of things. They really have absolutely everything they need from their region. They can make their own shoes and carpets and gurs. Traditionally, they would heat the houses with the yak patties. Now they're using some coal and things like that, depending on where you go. But really, they had everything they needed, and they still do, which is a really beautiful lesson.
It is. It's nose to tail, but you really see it in action. It's not just a catchphrase, that they were really using every part of the animal. And what I also liked about our time with Oscar's family there was that he was training his daughters. And as you said, he was training a new eagle. He was training them to work with their eagle so that they could become good eagle hunters. So the daughters would have like a piece of rabbit or raw meat at the bottom of the hill. This was not the big competition thing. So they would take the eagle up a little bit, or the father would. Then they would take its little hood off so it could see. And then she would call it, having this raw meat in her hand, and it would come. And so I think there's a sense in which they train it, obviously, so that it knows its master or eagle hunter's call and it will come to them. And then they would re-hood it so it couldn't see. But those birds were so big and it was so beautiful. I felt like they were as tender with the eagle as they were with one another in the training. It was really lovely to be a part of.
Yes.
And then we did spend time, as you mentioned earlier, in Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital city. And Mongolia is so sparsely populated that of the 3 million people, the 3 million inhabitants there, over half of them live in that one city. So we saw modernity, but again, with the tradition still infused. And then we saw people living more traditionally in the outskirts. With all that we saw, Mary, what did you see in terms of modernity creeping in, for better or for worse?
I think two things, really. The biggest thing I would say would be the candy on the greeting tables. We didn't get it at all of them, like the last house that we went to, the last family, but that's definitely, I think, problematic. And I see that around the globe, that because they do have everything they need from that region, there's nothing there that they feel is special to give to a guest. So they really go out of their way to go and get something from the modern town and bring it to, and of course that starts to normalize it, right? And bring that culture in. So I think that would be the biggest problem. The other thing, and I don't know if it's problematic with this group or not yet, I didn't see the problems that I see in other cultures with it, but that would be the cell phones, that a lot of people now have cell phones. And although there's not always data everywhere you go and things like that, that absolutely will change places. I certainly saw with the tribes that I visited in the Amazon earlier this year, the way that it rapidly changed their culture when the NGOs donated the cell phones so that the kids could go to school. So I didn't see the same result with these girls and with these kids, but I think those would be mine. What would be yours?
Two things come to mind. The first is the artificial light, because I'm a big fan of natural light. So I guess it helps that they can stay up late at night. They had often almost like a car battery in the gur, some of them, and then they would attach two little wires to it to get just like a fluorescent tube of light in the place. So I guess it helps that they can work at night, but I do wonder if that will start to impact people. Some people may think, oh, that's negligible. Maybe so. I hope so, because they spend most of their time outside exposed to natural light. So that's encouraging. But the other thing was the cell phones as well. And I had an experience apart from you, Mary, when I visited one of the drivers' homes, and each of his kids, who I believe were like 8, 10, and maybe 15, had a phone. And the TV was on. And the girls you and I went to, they didn't have TVs even. But in this case, it was a more modern home, closer to a village. And not only was the TV on, at one point, I was the only person in the room that wasn't on a phone.
Wow.
I'm not saying that as a point of pride. I'm saying it as a point of sadness, because they were all on their individual phones. And the father had just finished driving me on a long trip through the Gobi Desert. And so there wasn't interaction. I was so saddened to see it. These phones that are supposed to keep us connected actually disconnect us. And I'm afraid they're interfering with some of the closeness that is part of the Mongolian tradition for these families. So I was concerned, but again, I only saw this in the more modern households, the TVs and the cell phones. I didn't see this so much in the gurs and the outskirts of the city.
Yeah, I think in the outskirts, it would be interesting. I'm already jonesing to go back. I don't know about you, especially to that last family, but It was so relaxing. It was like a meditation to be with them. The kind of battery that they were using, I've seen in other regions as well, and they're often solar powered. That's what it seems like it might be. And if that's the case, it's not going to work most of the year. I also noticed that they were primarily just using it for an hour or two during the darkness. So while they finished up dinner, they still went to bed early and woke early. So I think if it's used like the other regions, then perhaps it wouldn't cause as much damage, since they are out milking the yaks so early and they're out all day. But I agree with you. There's something just so beautiful about living with candlelight. And scientifically, it's obviously very important for our hormones to not have those lights and be exposed to those lights. That's a very good insight.
So we're going to have to wrap up now, Mary, but I'm hoping we can get an article in the journal so we can elaborate on some of these experiences and let people see the pictures of these glorious people with these beautiful round faces that are ruddy from the elements and the sun, but not from acne or eczema.
Yes, beautiful skin.
I know, they were so gorgeous and in so many ways. And hospitality, I do want to mention here, is one of their hallmarks that we experienced, obviously, as Mary said, the milk tea right away. Anything we needed was given to us. It was so thoughtful. But I understood that Mongolia is so vast that one of our friends told us that people will actually leave their gurs open so that if a traveler is coming by and can't quite make it to the next village or wherever he's headed, he is welcome to stop by, even if he doesn't know the family. And you can also set up camp wherever you like, as long as it's not a national park that's off limits, but on anybody's land, because the land belongs to everyone. So it was just such an example of how to live in community with one another on this earth with hospitality and offering all of what you have, including your very gur.
Yes, that's exactly it. It was one of the most generous places that I've been to, generous of heart, generous of food, physical needs, in all ways, just so generous. And there was beauty in the simplicity that, especially the further out that you got, it was like living in a meditation. They're really in touch with something that's very important that I think we all have access to. And it's easy to lose sight of the gifts that we have and bring that into our modern day. And I don't know about you, but I think for my big takeaway from this trip was to have much more family time. I love how much time they spend with each other.
Absolutely. And I think, to me, one of the takeaways also was to be present. At one point, I got to ride a camel and I was just thinking, Hilda, remember the feel of this fur. I just couldn't get over how thick the camel was. And the man that was with me helping to guide the camel was wearing his traditional clothing. And I was like, remember that vibrant blue and the clip clop of the camel's feet. I was just trying to hold on to it. And I think there's so many experiences that elude us because we get sucked into the virtual world. And there's so much beauty right outside our door. There's so much beauty right next to us that we miss because we're not present. So I felt like I was called back, like you said, into a more meditative, mindful way of living.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of their happiness comes from. Aside from the food making their feel-good chemicals, they're very present. Yes.
So now I want to ask you the question I pose at the end here, Mary. If the listener could just do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do?
I think if it was only one thing, it would be getting up and watching the sunrise every day and spending at least the first hour outside. The research is just piling in on what the light does for us, for our microbiome, for our hormones, for our wake hormones and sleep and happiness and the downregulation of histamine, the upregulation of dopamine. I think there's very few things that are more important than getting back in line with nature. And when we're outside, we do calm down. And ultimately, if there's one thing that is the most helpful, no question in my mind, is to be relaxed and happy. And nature tends to do that for us. So my advice would be to get outside for the first hour of the day.
Wonderful, Mary. Thank you so much for this conversation. I loved being your traveling companion and exploring this community, these people groups I'd never encountered before. And I wish you all the best on your next travels, whether I get to join you or not. Thank you.
Well, I certainly hope you do. It was a blast to have you. I feel that your presence was a gift. So thank you for coming.
Our guest today was Mary Ruddick. Visit her website, enableyourhealing.com, for more information on Mary, her studies, courses, and programs. And I'm Hilda Labrada-Gore, the host and producer of this podcast for the Weston A. Price Foundation. You can find me at holistichilda.com. And for the transcript for this podcast, visit our website, westonaprice.org, and click on the podcast page. And now for a letter to the editor from a recent Wise Traditions journal. Remember that the journal is available for all members, and you can become a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation for $30 using the code POD10. And that makes you a member for a year, and you get 4 of these journals. I would like to report adverse effects from the turning on of 5G. Since the beginning of 2022, my husband has been battling a health decline. My husband was 30 years old at the new year and is now 31. We think your email announcement about the 5G turn on and his sudden health issues are not coincidental. As Pope St. John Paul II said, in the designs of providence, there are no mere coincidences. In these past 7 months, my husband has experienced unending fatigue and not many hours sleep at night. He's had weight gain and difficulty losing weight, difficulty breathing, night and day, and headaches. We live in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona. We are certainly immersed in EMF smog and the electric grid. In the past couple of months, it seems my husband has become adapted to the 5G technology and he is breathing easier and sleeping better. The fatigue is still a concern, but really life has to continue, so he is pushing himself through it. As for me, I went through the fatigue just as he did, but I bounced back a little faster. Being hit hard, but then bouncing back is something Dr. Louisa Williams spoke of on Wise Traditions Podcast 373. Nevertheless, my husband and I have decided to leave the Phoenix Valley and move to a small town with lots of native desert in Wickenburg, Arizona. We look forward to living a natural and clean lifestyle. Thank you to the Weston A. Price Foundation for helping lead us to this change. The 5G and small cell technologies are truly evil. How dare a few individuals make such large and lasting impact on the common folk like us? We will keep fighting against 5G technology and for health freedom. This is a letter from Casey from Phoenix, Arizona. Casey, we hope you're enjoying your new location. We're glad that our information has been of help to you. 5G is definitely an unseen but real threat to our health. So thank you for fighting against this kind of impact on our health and fighting for health freedom. We applaud you, and we invite you also to write a letter to the editor if you'd care to. Just write us at info@westonaprice.org, put letter to the editor in the subject line, and tell us your own testimonial or a story about how a podcast episode or something in the journal has helped you navigate your health journey. And thank you so much for listening, my friend. Stay well. Hasta pronto.
On behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation, thanks for listening. We have many free resources to support you on your health journey. Visit westonaprice.org to find podcasts, articles, videos, and more. You can also find a local chapter near you for help in finding sources of great food. We invite you to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism by becoming a member. Thanks again, and take care. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.